For over a decade, the public has been bombarded with dire warnings that a man-made crisis of global warming is upon us. This so-called crisis transpiring, ostensibly, as a consequence of the rise in the concentration of greenhouse gas molecules in the atmosphere that has ensued from the increase in man's combustion of fossil fuels associated with the industrial age. In response, the government has implemented programs to replace the energy obtained through the combustion of fossil fuels with green energy sources, such as windmills and solar power, and enacted legislation requiring a reduction of carbon dioxide emissions. Despite the many billions of dollars spent in developing and subsidizing this effort and the massive increases in energy costs passed on to the consumer, there is no discernible effect on either greenhouse gas levels or the Earth's climate. In fact, those perpetrating this hoax claim the status of the environment is worse than ever. This documentary will demonstrate that the alarm about man-made global warming is without merit, and that the entire basis of these assertions is a fabrication conjured by those with ulterior motivations. It will debunk the reasons given by both the environmentalist lobby and the government to promote this falsehood. And finally, it will examine why academic, political, and media elitists have perpetrated a convenient lie, the hoax of man-made global warming. Man's interpretation of nature has often been faulty. We once thought the Earth was the center of the universe, and that the sun traveled around the Earth. We once thought that weather was controlled by gods. Now that we have realized that gods do not control the weather, our narcissism has led us to believe that we control the weather. Thus, the myth of man-made global warming has come to be accepted as fact, not based on evidence, because there is none, but rather through a deceitful propaganda campaign based upon lies. If greenhouse gas molecules in the atmosphere increase ambient temperature, then why is the Moon, located in the same region of space as the Earth and lacking any greenhouse gas molecules, warmer than the Earth in the daytime? If greenhouse gas molecules cause climate change, then why does Venus, with 9,000 times the greenhouse gas molecular concentration in its atmosphere, lack any climate change? If the Earth is getting hotter, then why have 38 of the 50 states in the United States had their highest recorded temperature prior to 1954? The debate over man-made climate change has no merit. The methodology used to determine the average temperature of the Earth lacks any legitimacy whatsoever. One would suppose that to calculate the average temperature of the Earth would require very sophisticated instrumentation. Yet these calculations are performed using 300-year-old technology, the thermometer. The thermometer is a fixed device only capable of measuring the temperature in its immediate vicinity. Despite this severe limitation, the average measuring station is responsible for 40,000 square miles of the Earth's surface area. That would be equivalent to attempting to determine the temperature of the entire state of Ohio with a single thermometer. A disproportionate share of these thermometers are being enveloped within expanding urban centers, where significant but very localized temperature change occurs due to machinery and automobiles generating heat, buildings and asphalt reflecting heat, and even the population itself producing heat, all affecting temperature independent of the overlying atmosphere. Data collected from these regions is inaccurate and invalid. The methodology used by those perpetrating this environmental hoax is fraught with deceptive practices. The locations of the weather stations used to collect temperature data at any one time vary and are chosen according to the preconceived bias of climatologists. Those monitoring the readings have a politically motivated predisposition in the interpretation of the data, as the data gathered has often been found to be erroneous. Even the locations of exactly which sites are being used as the monitoring stations are now concealed. Data which does not fit the paradigm is routinely discarded or altered, as most recently occurred in Australia. The manner in which the average temperature is determined is not through a direct arithmetic average, but is indirectly calculated through a formula utilizing temperature anomalies. What defines an anomaly is left to the discretion of the environmentalist observer. The selection of the data to be incorporated into the formula is not independently verified. Neither the information gathered nor the methodology employed by those asserting global warming or climate change is accessible to third-party investigators in violation of what is considered legitimate research practice. The entire process is faulty, prone to error, subject to bias, and is bereft of even a shred of legitimacy. In contrast to the results calculated from readings of thermometers, data collected from satellites, a far more accurate means of measuring temperature, has been unable to detect any change in over 20 years. It is well documented that the Earth has gone through significant changes in climate long before the advent of the combustion of fossil fuels. Cyclical changes in the environment from ice ages to nearly universal tropical climates have occurred for eons. For example, the Great Lakes were formed from receding glaciers 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, a process that would be blamed on the burning of fossil fuels if it occurred today. In the discussion of the greenhouse gas effect, one must understand basic scientific principles. Energy travels through space in the form of self-propagating electromagnetic waves. The number of waves propagated per second is referred to as its frequency. Each type of electromagnetic wave has a characteristic frequency. Matter is made up of atoms. Each type of atom forms a specific element, each with characteristic physical and chemical properties. Two or more atoms combine to form a molecule. Energy will interact with matter dependent on matter's molecular characteristics and the frequency of the electromagnetic radiation. For instance, each color in the rainbow has a specific frequency, which when it interacts with particular atoms results in a specific color. When electromagnetic waves impinge on an atom, there are three possible effects. The wave will pass through the atom, not affecting it. The wave will be reflected, why gold looks yellow, or the wave will be absorbed. Which of these effects occurs depends on the nature of both the atom and the electromagnetic wave. Atoms are most stable in their lowest energy state. Atoms absorbing energy will increase in their activity and seek to release that excess energy by emitting electromagnetic waves. Temperature is defined as the average of molecular kinetic energy. Increasing kinetic energy causes an increase in temperature. Heat is defined as the sum of molecular kinetic energy. The sun's radiant energy travels through space as electromagnetic radiation. The sun's radiation encounters ever greater concentrations of molecules the closer it gets to the Earth's surface, accounting for increased temperature and increased intensity of color. At the surface, the majority of the sun's radiant energy is finally absorbed. The term greenhouse gas effect is taken from similarities with another phenomenon called the greenhouse glass effect. In the greenhouse glass effect, a glass-enclosed room will have a higher temperature during the day than the immediate surrounding environment. Electromagnetic waves pass through glass and interact with matter inside the greenhouse, elevating the energy levels of the molecules, causing them to accelerate, increasing ambient temperature. These molecules release their excess energy in the form of electromagnetic waves, though not necessarily at the same wavelength as those absorbed. Some of these emitted electromagnetic waves will be in the form of infrared rays, which is heat energy. Infrared rays are of longer wavelength than that of the electromagnetic waves that had originally passed through the glass and cannot pass back through the glass. Trapped inside the greenhouse, these molecules increase the internal temperature, making the inside of the greenhouse warmer than the outside temperature. There are molecules in the atmosphere that interact with infrared rays in a manner similar to glass. These molecules are referred to as greenhouse gas molecules. Despite the similarities between the greenhouse glass effect and the greenhouse gas effect, there are important differences. The greenhouse has a fixed glass boundary that blocks the escape of infrared rays. The atmosphere, on the other hand, does not have a fixed boundary, so the molecules are not trapped in a confined space. The total heat energy in a region is the sum of the kinetic energy of all the molecules. If the molecules can expand into a larger space, then the concentration of molecules decreases and the average kinetic energy decreases, resulting in a lower temperature. The temperature outside the greenhouse will be less than that of the greenhouse. Another difference between the greenhouse gas effect and the greenhouse glass effect is that while glass reflects energy, molecules absorb energy. Unlike reflected heat energy, absorbed heat energy need not necessarily increase temperature, as we shall see. All molecules will absorb energy dependent on the frequency of the electromagnetic radiation, causing an increase in kinetic energy and temperature. These molecules will then release energy in the form of infrared rays. Some molecules have the capacity to absorb infrared rays. These are referred to as greenhouse gas molecules. The greenhouse gas property of these molecules is a function of the architecture of molecules and not of the atoms that make up that molecule. For example, the nitrogen molecule made up of 2 nitrogen atoms and the oxygen molecule made up of 2 oxygen atoms lack any greenhouse gas effect. However, the combination of nitrogen and oxygen atoms forming the nitrous oxide molecule does have a greenhouse gas effect. The majority of gases in the Earth's atmosphere are nitrogen and oxygen, accounting for over 95% of the total. The 2 major greenhouse gas molecules are H2O and carbon dioxide. For every 1 million molecules in Earth's atmosphere, there are between 10,000 and 40,000 H2O molecules, and today, about 400 carbon dioxide molecules. The major greenhouse gas molecules in Earth's atmosphere are H2O and carbon dioxide. The laws of physics state that matter can neither be created nor destroyed, but may be transformed. The carbon dioxide found in the atmosphere goes through a cycle. Carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis that occurs in green plants. This process takes the carbon in carbon dioxide and creates high-energy, long-chain carbon molecules that are used to power metabolism and make up the structures of these plants. Then, other living things eat these plants, consuming the carbon chains which provide energy and are incorporated into their structures. These living things are in turn consumed by other organisms. When these carbon-based organisms pass on, they are decomposed by bacteria and fungi, and in the process, carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere in an endless cycle. 97% of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere is a result of nature's activities independent of man. Every carbon molecule in living things was once found in the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere. Fossil fuels are simply the remnants of organic compounds that avoided immediate decomposition and became converted by geological forces into substances of concentrated energy trapped in the carbon chains that we call oil, natural gas, and coal. The combustion of these fossil fuels releases the carbon inside these substances in the form of carbon dioxide, indistinguishable from that produced from any other source. Man's combustion of fossil fuels accounts for only about 3 of every 100 carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere. The assertion of the hucksters is that the concentration of greenhouse gas molecules, particularly carbon dioxide, is increasing due to man's combustion of fossil fuels, resulting in an unnatural increase in Earth's temperature. Do greenhouse gas molecules actually increase daily high temperatures and increase climate change? How can we measure the greenhouse gas effect? The greenhouse gas effect is to absorb electromagnetic radiation when ambient energy levels are high, and to release electromagnetic radiation as ambient energy levels decline. Greenhouse gas molecules' absorption of the sun's energy reduces surface temperatures in the daytime. Conversely, in the evening, greenhouse gas molecules' release of energy and absorption of infrared rays from the surface conserves surface temperatures. The correct way to gauge the greenhouse gas effect is not by measuring daily high temperatures, but in measuring the difference between daytime high and nighttime low temperatures. The greater the greenhouse gas effect, the smaller the difference between daily high and low temperatures. This effect can be illustrated here on Earth. There are atmospheric conditions on Earth that highlight the greenhouse gas effect. The only greenhouse gas in Earth's atmosphere that varies in concentration according to region is H2O. Desert regions, such as Death Valley, have relatively low concentrations of water vapor in the atmosphere when compared to more humid regions. Because of the comparatively low concentration of H2O vapor in the desert, more of the sun's radiation reaches the Earth's surface during the day. but more heat energy escapes in the evening. This results in relatively higher daytime temperatures and relatively lower evening temperatures in desert regions when compared to more humid regions. That is the reason that desert regions experience an average of 30-degree Fahrenheit variance between daily highs to evening lows, while more humid regions experience an average variance of only 15 degrees Fahrenheit. It is a testament to the ignorance of the environmental hucksters that they lack an understanding of even how to quantify the greenhouse gas effect. Another method to measure the greenhouse gas effect is by comparison with other celestial bodies. The Moon occupies the same region in space as Earth and receives equal concentrations of the Sun's radiant energy. The Moon has no atmosphere and lacks any greenhouse gas effect, yet experiences far greater daytime surface temperatures than Earth, reaching daily highs of 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And despite its exceedingly elevated daytime temperatures, the Moon's surface temperature dips to 350 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit after the Sun sets. The Moon has a daily shift in temperature of about 600 degrees Fahrenheit. So the Moon, without any greenhouse gas molecules, is far hotter than the Earth during the day and far colder in the evening. The greenhouse gas effect may also be measured through the observation of other planets in our solar system. Mars has an atmosphere and experiences average daytime highs of about 30 degrees Fahrenheit and average nighttime lows of about minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, or about a 100-degree day-to-night variance. Mars's atmosphere is 99% greenhouse gas molecules, essentially 100% of which is carbon dioxide. Mercury, the planet that is closest to the Sun, lacks an atmosphere and, like the Moon, experiences large day-to-evening temperature shifts from daytime temperatures of 800 degrees Fahrenheit to evening temperatures of minus 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Note that although Mars is much further from the Sun than Mercury, Mars experiences significantly warmer evening temperatures than does Mercury, owing to Mars's greenhouse gas effect. Venus, the planet second closest to the Sun, experiences a constant daytime and evening temperature of more than 800 degrees Fahrenheit, owing to its very dense atmosphere. Venus has an atmosphere that is so dense it has a greenhouse gas effect of 100%, blocking loss of any energy from the surface at night. The atmosphere of Venus is 99% greenhouse gas molecules, of which 100% is carbon dioxide. Note that Mercury, lacking greenhouse gas molecules, has high temperatures as great as that of the planet Venus and experiences a day-to-evening variance of 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. Venus, exhibiting a nearly 100% greenhouse gas effect, has a 0-degree Fahrenheit variance between day and evening temperatures, once again illustrating that the proper manner in gauging the greenhouse gas effect is in measuring the difference between daytime high and evening low temperatures. Not all greenhouse gas molecules are equal. Mars, with 1/60th the atmospheric density as Earth, nevertheless has a greater greenhouse gas composition owing to its nearly 100% composition of greenhouse gas molecules in its atmosphere. Compare this to Earth's 1% composition. The concentration of greenhouse gas molecules in Mars's atmosphere is double that found in Earth's, with 40 times the carbon dioxide concentration. The atmosphere in Venus has 90 times the density as that of Earth, 9,000 times the greenhouse gas density, and 225,000 times the carbon dioxide concentration. An oddity among these planets is noted in the relationship between the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere and its relative greenhouse gas effect. The order of greenhouse gas concentration in the planet's atmosphere from greater to lesser is Venus, Mars, Earth, and Mercury. However, the greenhouse gas effect from greater to lesser is Venus, Earth, Mars, and Mercury. The order of greenhouse gas concentration is not the same as the greenhouse gas effect. Mars, with double the greenhouse gas concentration of Earth's, averages a day-to-evening temperature difference of 100 degrees, compared to Earth's day-to-evening temperature difference of 30 degrees. This is a consequence of not all greenhouse gas molecules having the same capacity. When matter absorbs or releases energy, two possible events occur, either a change in temperature or a change in state. The states of matter are solid, liquid, and gas. The amount of energy required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of a substance in a particular state, 1 degree centigrade, is defined as its specific heat. Raising the temperature of 1 gram of liquid H2O 1 degree centigrade requires 1 calorie of energy. Changing the state of matter also requires the input or release of energy. The energy required to change matter from one state to another is called its property of latent energy, because although a change of state transpires, molecular bonds are not broken, no change in the kinetic energy of the molecules occurs, and there is no change in temperature. Among the greenhouse gas molecules, the property of latent energy has practical consequences only for H2O, because only H2O on Earth exists naturally in all 3 states of matter, while carbon dioxide exists naturally only in its gaseous form. The greenhouse gas potential of H2O is a consequence of the property of hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonds form between neighboring water molecules. This happens because the hydrogen atom is attracted to both its own oxygen and other oxygen atoms that come close enough. The oxygen nucleus has 8 plus charges compared to hydrogen's 1 plus charge, so it attracts hydrogen electrons from neighboring H2O molecules, forming the basis of hydrogen bonding. The bonding gives water an exceptionally high heat of vaporization, which means considerable thermal energy is needed to change liquid water into water vapor. The latent heat of vaporization for H2O requires the absorption of 540 calories of energy to change 1 gram of liquid H2O to vapor. Compare this to the specific heat of H2O of 1 calorie. Vapor is a state of equilibrium between a liquid and gas, which can easily be converted back to a liquid by applying pressure and without changing the temperature. H2O on Earth is technically never in gaseous form, as the temperature is not high enough in nature to reach its critical temperature of 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, has a boiling temperature of minus 109 degrees Fahrenheit. H2O in the atmosphere absorbs and releases large amounts of both the sun's radiant energy and energy emanating from the Earth's surface without a change in temperature occurring. During the day, H2O absorbs energy, changing from liquid to vapor in the process. In the evening, H2O vapor releases energy, changing from vapor to liquid, referred to as dew, both events transpiring without temperature change. Thus, the very powerful buffering effect of H2O on temperature through its property of latent energy blunts any movement toward temperature extremes, whether cold or hot. The 2 major greenhouse gas molecules in Earth's atmosphere are H2O and carbon dioxide. For every 100 greenhouse gas molecules in Earth's atmosphere, 95 are H2O vapor and 4 are carbon dioxide. For every 100 carbon dioxide molecules, only 3 are produced by the combustion of fossil fuels. A 20% reduction in the combustion of fossil fuels would eliminate 1 greenhouse gas molecule for every 5,000 greenhouse gas molecules in the Earth's atmosphere. For every calorie of heat that 1 gram of carbon dioxide absorbs, 1 gram of H2O vapor absorbs 2,200 calories. H2O vapor is 10 times more plentiful by mass in Earth's atmosphere than carbon dioxide. So for every calorie carbon dioxide absorbs, H2O absorbs 22,000 calories. Since only 3% of the carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere is produced through the combustion of fossil fuels, then for each calorie of heat absorbed by carbon dioxide produced from man's combustion of fossil fuels, H2O vapor will absorb over 700,000 calories. The sought-after 20% reduction in fossil fuel combustion would result in only a reduction of 1 calorie of heat absorption for every 3.5 million calories of heat absorbed in Earth's atmosphere. Carbon dioxide's inferior capacity in comparison to H2O and its greenhouse gas effect, the relatively low level of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere, and man's puny production of carbon dioxide when compared to other sources of atmospheric carbon dioxide make the arguments of those claiming a relationship between man's production of carbon dioxide and global warming obviously absurd. Other erroneous assertions proffered by the environmentalist hucksters include concerns over the supposed warming of the oceans. Heating H2O causes the hotter, faster-moving molecules to escape into the atmosphere, leaving behind cooler, slower-moving molecules. Additionally, the water vapor molecules escaping into the overlying atmosphere block the sun's radiation, thus decreasing the energy impacting the water's surface. This acts as a deterrent to, and not a promoter of, oceanic warming. Environmentalists assert that melting polar ice is causing oceans to rise. But NASA, a government agency that promotes the belief in man-produced global warming, issued this report in September 2014. Since the late 1970s, the Arctic has lost an average of 20,800 square miles of ice a year. The Antarctic has gained an average of 7,300 square miles. On September 19th this year, for the first time ever since 1979, Antarctic sea ice extent exceeded 7.72 million square miles, according to the National Snow and Ice Data Center. The ice extent stayed above this benchmark extent for several days. The average maximum extent between 1981 and 2010 was 7.23 million square miles. However, the relatively greater loss of ice in the Arctic compared to the gain of ice in the Antarctic is irrelevant, because the Arctic ice mass floats on water while the Antarctic ice mass is mostly on land. Ice is less dense than water. As ice melts and converts into water, less space is occupied. In fact, if the entire Arctic melted, sea levels would not rise 1 inch. Also, if the Earth is getting warmer, why is the Antarctic ice mass increasing? Environmentalists assert a tipping effect, whereby a relatively small increase in the atmosphere's carbon dioxide concentration will result in an inexorable increase in temperature. Any increase in surface temperature will result in an increase in H2O vapor in the atmosphere, effectively blocking the sun's radiation, thus neutralizing any temperature increase. In fact, the only way to increase the Earth's surface temperature is if the quantity of the sun's radiant energy striking the Earth increases, which is exactly what happens during the summer months. Environmentalists promote the notion that the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide is unique to the modern era. This is erroneous, as there is ample evidence that atmospheric carbon dioxide levels have been vastly greater than the present levels. One explanation of an increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide is as the Earth goes through warming periods, life forms increase in number, thus increasing the quantity of the largest source of atmospheric carbon dioxide. As this increased quantity of carbon-based life forms, passes on, and is decomposed, the quantity of atmospheric carbon dioxide increases. Higher levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide are a consequence of, and not the cause of, a warming trend. If Earth's average temperature is rising, which is as yet unproved, it must be due to other factors besides man's production of carbon dioxide. Since Earth's temperatures has varied greatly during the eons of its existence, without any possible influence from man's activities, then other influences must be the cause. The seasons are due to the annual periodic changing of the angulation of the Earth towards the Sun. The importance of this angulation is highlighted by the fact that even when the Earth, in its orbit, draws millions of miles closer to the Sun, this does not change the climate. Climate and temperature are not affected by Earth's distance from the Sun, but are rather a consequence of the changing angulation on its axis relative to the Sun. The climate on Earth is unaffected by its relationship in its orbit with the Sun. For 6 months of the year, the northern hemisphere is angled towards the Sun, while the southern hemisphere is angled away from the Sun, and then vice versa for the other 6 months. When the Earth's surface is angled toward the Sun, radiation is more concentrated, elevating energy levels and temperature. This occurs in the spring and summer. When the angulation is away from the Sun, the radiant energy is dispersed over a larger area, thus decreasing temperature. This occurs in autumn and winter. This is the reason that the seasons of the northern and southern hemispheres are opposite and the equator has an essentially constant temperature. The angle of inclination of the Earth towards the Sun varies cyclically, with a periodicity lasting many hundreds of years. The angle of inclination will change from a minimum of 22.1 degrees to a maximum of 24.5 degrees. Therefore, the total shift of a hemisphere towards or away from the Sun in a given year can range from a minimum of 44.2 degrees to a maximum of 49 degrees, or nearly a 5-degree or 10% difference in angulation. Considering that the seasonal average 47-degree shift in the angle of Earth's inclination results in a 60-degree temperature change from summer to winter, then a 5-degree deviation in the angle of inclination could result in a 6 to 7 degree Fahrenheit change in the daily temperature average. This would account for the alternating instances of ice ages and tropical climates the Earth has experienced throughout the ages. In the 1970s, the same environmentalists that are today waxing frantically over the impending doom represented by global warming were predicting another ice age. Today, as the scientific evidence mounts against a man-made warming trend, the environmentalist hysterics are constrained to alter their mantra from man-made global warming to climate change. As climate change is far more difficult to quantify than daily temperatures, it is convenient to blame man for any extreme climate event that may occur, regardless that climate extremes are as old as the Earth itself. This myth of climate change as a consequence of adding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is merely a sign of desperation. Science actually proves the contrary. Increasing the concentration of greenhouse gas molecules in the atmosphere decreases climate change by narrowing temperature ranges and thus decreasing molecular movement in the atmosphere. Evidence for this is seen on Venus. Venus has a 100% greenhouse gas effect. Without a change in molecular movement, there cannot develop alterations in atmospheric pressures, which is required in the production of wind and change in climate. As wind is the physical evidence of molecular movement, when there is no wind, that means no molecules are moving. Thus, climate is not changing. Venus, with a 100% greenhouse gas effect, lacks any change in climate on its surface. The point is that Earth's average temperature and climate may change as it has many times in the past, but those changes are completely independent of man's activities as regards to the combustion of fossil fuels. The reasons behind the hoax of man-made global warming and climate change. The hysteria over Earth's climate is not driven by science, but by politics and greed. In 2007, the United States Supreme Court, at the behest of government petty bureaucrats, declared carbon dioxide a pollutant. In its decision is stated, "For when carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, it acts like the ceiling of a greenhouse, trapping solar energy and retarding the escape of reflected heat. It is therefore a species, the most important species, of a greenhouse gas." As we've shown, carbon dioxide is nowhere near the most significant of greenhouse gas molecules. The atmosphere lacks a ceiling. This subject is well beyond the expertise of those in the legal profession or in politics. Decisions over issues of science, private enterprise, and the internal affairs of a state are constitutionally excluded from Supreme Court review because the founders of the nation were cognizant that the knowledge necessary to cast appropriate judgment on subjects of this nature requires an intimate comprehension, well beyond the justice's knowledge base. Such topics are to be decided on concrete, verifiable evidence, not on opinion. In science, adherence to a methodology is required to prove a hypothesis. Once the hypothesis is proposed, the variables are identified and an experimental design is created to test the validity of the hypothesis. The result must be replicated every time the experiment is performed. No such process was ever performed to validate the proposed hypothesis of man-made global warming. There is the uncertainty as to which variables might have an effect on global climate. No evidence of a global elevation in Earth's temperature even exists. No experiment has been devised that would demonstrate that an increase in the level of carbon dioxide attributed to the combustion of fossil fuels would actually raise average temperatures. No evidence has been presented that the increase in carbon dioxide over the last 100 years is attributable to the combustion of fossil fuels. There is no proof of a problem and no evidence that even if the problem existed, the design of the solution could possibly function. Yet with all of this uncertainty, lack of evidence, and no attempt at an experimental or engineering design to prove the hypothesis or the efficacy of the solution, nevertheless, the court, among whose justices is not a single individual trained as either a scientist or an engineer, considers itself of sufficient knowledge to reach a decision on a subject that encompasses the vastness of the Earth, its atmosphere, and its history, covering more than 3 billion years. Carbon dioxide production is a byproduct of the metabolic function of all living organisms, indistinguishable from the carbon dioxide released through man's combustion of fossil fuels. This is not surprising, because the carbon found in coal and oil was once present in organic life forms. Oxygen and H2O are also produced and consumed in a manner similar to that of carbon dioxide. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, and H2O are equally necessary for life. If carbon dioxide is a pollutant, then oxygen and H2O are as well. Even on legal grounds, the court's decision lacks any merit. There are elements required in the bringing of a case of injury. First, the plaintiff must have suffered an injury in fact, an invasion of a legally protected interest, which is A, concrete and particularized, B, actual or imminent, not conjectural or hypothetical. Second, there must be a causal connection between the injury and the conduct complained of. The injury has to be fairly traceable to the challenged action of the defendant and not the result of the independent action of some third party not before the court. Third, it must be likely, as opposed to merely speculative, that the injury will be redressed by a favorable decision. In this instance, the injury is hypothetical, not concrete or particularized. The assertion of injury is not traceable to defendant. There is no evidence that the injury asserted can be redressed by the decision. However, we do have evidence of a different nature. The evidence all around us is that man's combustion of coal, natural gas, and oil represent the greatest boon to mankind in the history of civilization. It is the genius of the human brain that created the means to unlock and harness the tremendous energy found in fossil fuels. Fuels which otherwise would be of little value. The miraculous invention of the internal combustion engine is the means by which the highly concentrated energy stored in these substances is made available. The internal combustion engine has advanced civilizations in the last 150 years, not witnessed in the previous 15,000 years. And what benefits do we derive from the ability to create machines that can use this once locked up energy? Well, essentially everything that allows modern civilization to exist. It is the reason that we have cars and planes. It is the reason we have heat in the winter and air conditioning in the summer. It is the reason we have computers and cell phones and washing machines and modern medicine. Without the ability of human beings to mechanize through the effective utilization of fossil fuels, we would live dreary, miserable, disease-ridden lives in darkness with lower life expectancy, continual threats of starvation, and endless poverty. The Supreme Court's absurd decision decreeing that carbon dioxide is a pollutant that needs to be controlled by the federal government categorizes every living organism's essential metabolic processes as pollution and potentially subject to federal regulation. Every human endeavor is now subject to federal regulation. Because this is a fabricated problem without a possible solution, it gives the government carte blanche power to impose rule arbitrarily and autocratically. Exactly the authority all governments crave. That is the true purpose of this decision, to increase government power. Let us begin with an examination of environmental hucksters. Let's say that I have an organization to investigate environmental concerns and I find that there are none. Then I go forth and say, there is no problem, everything is fine. Would anyone send money to support my organization? Not much chance of that. If instead I make up scenarios of climactic doom, I get people to believe that immediate action is required or all is lost. Then my pleas for contributions gain traction, and people send money to my organization so we can prevent this environmental calamity, whatever it is, before it is too late. I just have to create an atmosphere of never-ending crisis, irrespective of what is really occurring, and the money keeps flowing. This tactic has made environmental groups very rich. There is never a resolution, never any improvement. Always one crisis followed by another. These organizations must maintain a perpetual propaganda campaign to generate mass hysteria, to justify their continued existence. And as they would have us believe, it is absolutely essential that these organizations continue on. Because no matter how bad things are, they would be far worse if these groups did not exist. In reality, they exist for no other reason than their own personal profit. Now let's turn to cap and trade. According to this scheme, every company and every country will be allotted a maximum amount of carbon dioxide emissions. A third-party government agency, such as the United Nations, will determine the levels permitted. The corruption, so prevalent among the members of the United Nations, will lead to an undermining of the program. A program built on false premises. Any company or country which exceeds its allotment will have the option of either paying a fine or buying the right to increased carbon dioxide emissions from another company or country which produces less than its allotment. How will the emissions be measured and allotments determined? The measurements will be based on the affected company's ability to pay. Carbon dioxide emission allotments will then be bought and sold as commodities, sold on an exchange with brokers providing the means of transaction for a fee. Those fees will be worth millions of dollars, and Al Gore is involved in this business. Underdeveloped countries will have excess capacity for carbon dioxide emissions because their economies are so backward and primitive. These countries, or rather their corrupt political leaders, will be rewarded for keeping their people in poverty. In an existence reminiscent of the Middle Ages, these politicians will profit from the transference of wealth while their respective populations suffer. The industrialized nations will be rewarding the Third World for their primitive lifestyle. So the industrialized nations will now subsidize backward nations, and those backward, underdeveloped nations will now have incentive not to progress. In the industrialized world, companies will be required to buy a certain amount of green energy from sources producing power from windmills and solar panels. The producers of these grossly inefficient and unreliable sources of energy will need to be heavily subsidized, since they will be incapable of generating sufficient revenue to cover their costs of production and maintenance. These companies in the windmill and solar energy business will receive billions of dollars in federal subsidies. While the average citizen will be limited as to energy consumption, government officials and friends of government officials, such as Al Gore, will face no such restrictions. Favored industries, which are politically connected, will be protected. Industries edging towards obsolescence, which otherwise would disappear, will be considered too big to fail and be subsidized. Sound familiar? Meanwhile, new and more efficient industries, which would compete with these antiquated companies, will be penalized with excessive carbon footprint taxes in order to protect the politically connected, inefficient, and incompetently managed companies. Politicians are ignorant narcissists, prone to hyperbole and usually act in response to emotion or self-interest. The hysteria surrounding the supposed global warming trend comes from the intentional misinterpretation of events by those motivated by profit and self-aggrandizement. None of this is new or novel. We have seen this type of government behavior many times before. The government and its bureaucracies will grow in size through increased taxes, collections of penalties, requirements for carbon emission licenses, and cap-and-trade regulations. If the progress of civilization runs parallel to energy consumption, which direction are we going with mandatory energy reductions? A Brave New World or 1984? One interesting fact about cap and trade, which never seems to be mentioned, is that the program will not lower atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide at all. How will paying money in fines or buying a contract to increase a company's or country's carbon dioxide emission allocation actually lower the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Emissions will remain unabated. It will simply cost more to run a factory, to run a country, or even to live. This is clear evidence that the hucksters' scheme behind the cap and trade regulations is not to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, but instead to enrich government and enslave the people. Because emissions will not be decreased at all, why the urgency to create cap and trade legislations and impose controls on emissions? It's because events have overtaken the environmentalist con artists. Not only is there no evidence of an increase in the average daily temperature in the last 30 years, but there are indications that we may be heading towards a cooling trend, a trend that may result in another mini ice age, which occurred in the Middle Ages. Already, the charlatans in the global warming movement have had to change their mantra from global warming to climate change, attributing the usual natural alterations in temperature that have occurred long before the combustion of fossil fuels as somehow a byproduct of human activity. The environmentalist hucksters and their political allies realize that legislation must be passed immediately before the country wakes up to the reality of the massive hoax. Then, the snake oil salesman will be able to take credit for whatever natural event is occurring, and characterize it, regardless of which direction it goes, as a good thing, all the while claiming that they have saved the planet from environmental catastrophe. Could it get more ridiculous? Yet, the joke will be on us. Claims of man-made produced global warming are a hoax perpetrated by environmentalist hucksters led by charlatans and conmen like Al Gore, to achieve an economic and political agenda of their own devising. Who ultimately pays? It's the taxpayers who will be paying the subsidies and who have to absorb the increasing energy costs, all the while receiving less energy in the bargain. All goods and services will become more expensive as the hidden taxes and penalties will now cause an increase in the cost of production and manufacturing. Yet, another even more significant cost will be a loss of our freedoms. Now that governments can dictate energy uses, they will have achieved a stranglehold on all aspects of the economy in their respective nations. This gives government complete control over their population's energy utilization. When energy utilization is controlled by government, the people become slaves. Every politician's dream will have come true as all nations will be managed in a communistic, fascistic, statist manner. And they will assume this power paradoxically by using the mantra of saving the planet. The amazing progress of civilization in the industrialized world will be slowed, halted, or even reversed. We will never realize our future potential. All that will now be lost to future generations. The developing world, naive or corrupt enough to go along with the hysteria, will cease making progress, condemning their people to a perpetual dark ages type of existence. And the icing on the cake? We will have accomplished the goal that so much of the world has desired for so very long, the destruction of the United States. The United States, as a center of individual freedom, has been the focus of envy and hate from most of the world's other governments. And the grim irony is that the end of the United States will have been achieved at the hands of its very own government. The human mind is the only indispensable resource of civilization. The elephant and the cockroach live now exactly as they have lived for thousands of years. Do we really want a return to a primitive lifestyle? Do we really want a return to the time when we were dependent on human and animal labor? Do we really wish to sacrifice the wonders and freedoms provided by the marvels of modern technology upon an altar of environmental pseudoscience? Do we want to limit our children's future as a consequence of the hysteria generated by environmentalist hucksters? The marvel of human nature is a desire to advance beyond what is known, to reach for the stars. When the laws of government crush human ingenuity and strangle human creativity, we may never realize all that might have been achieved. When we allow our minds to be enslaved to government-inspired superstition, the loss to future civilizations may not be immediately apparent. Man can only perceive loss when something we hold dear is taken from us. We do not perceive the loss of that which has never existed. But one day, when future generations gaze upon the heavens, they may come to wonder what might have been. Government is the greatest hindrance to man's advancement because only government can indoctrinate myths and require belief in superstition. The inventions of free individuals have taken man to ever higher levels of understanding and achievement. But every new advance seems to raise fear in those afraid of progress, afraid of those who think for themselves and afraid of those who wish to be free. Al Gore and his ilk are a self-proclaimed priestly class believing they are prophets of the future. Actually, they are mired in superstition and fear, much like man in the Middle Ages. We must not allow those who would take us back to the Middle Ages to determine our future.